Morning, everyone, and welcome back, Carla. I saw Carla over here. It's good to have you back. This is a work session of the Portland City Council. It is December 10th, 2018, and I want to thank everybody for being here today to talk about the city's results on our top priorities. Today's session fits into the changes that we're making to create a more stable, predictable, and transparent budget process. The goal of the improved process, of course, is to enable the city to achieve our long-term goals and meet the long-term challenges while sustainably maintaining core city services. At this work session, we aim to turn city data into information for decision making with the goal of working smarter, not harder, in the coming year. To do that, we need to understand how well we're doing with our current resource allocations and with the policies and management practices that we currently have in place. Reviewing this information will help us focus on the results we're looking to achieve, especially as we consider our directions to develop next year's budget. We'll also highlight the results that several bureaus have achieved through business process improvements and using data to improve decision making. This practice of setting goals, evaluating our progress, and planning for the future is a practice that will enable the Council to make real progress on issues like homelessness, resiliency, public safety, and others. This year, we'll discuss performance in tandem with the city's budget forecast. I anticipate this will sharpen our focus on achieving results for the community through improved management practices and not just applying new resources. With that, I'll hand this off to Interim Budget Director Kennard to begin the conversation. Good morning, and thanks for having us here.
Good morning. Thank you, Mayor, and good morning to members of Council. I also want to thank and say good morning to members of our community budget advisors who are here in the audience today. CAO Reinhardt will be joining us at the table shortly, and Director Dessou from the Office of Equity and Human Rights, we hope will be joining us as soon as he is able. Thank you for being here to discuss the very important topics of citywide performance and the financial forecast. This marks CBO's third year of highlighting citywide prior year performance for you in print and in a presentation format. This year, we're pleased to have made some notable improvements to the process, which the Mayor already alluded to. First, we have organized the report in today's presentation to focus on priority issue areas irrespective of bureau boundaries, in contrast to previous reports and discussions which tend to take a bureau-by-bureau approach. While this may seem like a small and common sense change, it implies a much bigger change. For the city to govern and problem solve beyond bureau silos is a change we all know to be significant. This type of change necessitates a cultural shift that requires all of us, bureau staff, elected leadership, and community members, to change the way we address and invest in key issue areas. Many of the changes to the budget process that we are implementing this year aim to further facilitate this shift, and empower Council and bureaus to work together towards our common goals. Another improvement we have made to the structure of today's presentation is to make the data and information more actionable for Council. We know that in today's world, we are all inundated with data. What CBO is attempting to do with this report and this presentation is to turn performance data into useful, objective information to help inform your decision-making. We have worked with bureaus to highlight the data that we believe will be most useful to you as decision makers going forward. We will be teeing up discussion around key CBO findings and recommendations related to performance data to help inform investment decisions, and we have changed the timing of this presentation to be able to contextualize the performance discussion within the city's financial forecast. Do you want to go to the slideshow? Are we able to have the slideshow up there for the members of the public? To that end, today's agenda will begin with Josh's general fund forecast. We will then spend the bulk of the time today reviewing and discussing fiscal year 2017-18 performance data findings and recommendations. One thing to note is in an effort to prioritize your time, we have reduced the number of key issue areas we'll discuss to 4 priority areas. We've selected these areas as Council priorities based on recent investments and conversations with Council, but also because we found valuable and informative data we wanted to share with you. So, to fully immerse ourselves in the performance lingo, the general goals that I've laid out thus far are really the bigger, longer-term outcomes that we hope to move towards through this presentation. In the spirit of good performance management, we've also identified a few key outputs or more specific and shorter-term goals that we'd like to achieve with today's session. These include understand and discuss the data behind key council and city priorities and issues, recognize and learn from the bright spots in Bureau and city performance, identify and discuss potential solutions to address complex challenges with a work smarter, not harder approach, as the mayor alluded to, consider goals and priorities in the context of the financial outlook. We hope that today's session will include a fruitful discussion and encourage you all to interject at any time with your thoughts or your questions. With that, I'll turn it over to our city economist, Josh Harwood, to provide our economic outlook.
All right, thanks, Jessica, Mayor, Commissioners. Josh Howard, City Economist. We are going to go through this as fast as you want, I guess, but initially we're going to rip the Band-Aid off fast and get to the numbers. The first slide will talk to you about kind of where we're at with the general fund forecast. We expect that the December forecast, and the numbers are still wiggling a little bit because of overhead model things and things that are sort of we're working through, but basically we would expect the general fund forecast for December to show a very small amount of ongoing resources available for the 1920 budget, about 1 to 3 million, and an additional 12 to 14 million in one-time available. The way to think about where we are is the 1% constraint got us about $5.5 million. The commitments the council has made both in budget notes and in the fall bump offset most of that. And so essentially, the forecast is largely unchanged from April. And we'll get into some more details as we go. But essentially, property taxes came in actually a little bit lower this year. We're working with the county to understand that a little bit better. We're waiting on some reports from them. But essentially, property taxes came in lower. We're showing some weakness on a couple other revenue sources. And so as we work through this, we can talk a little bit more about the specifics. But there's pretty solid uncertainty within the forecast right now. As we flip to the next slide, in fact, in my tenure here at the city in about 8.5 years, this is the most uncertainty that I've been experiencing at this time of year. And you can see on the graph on the right is our business license tax collections, July to November. There's a couple of things I want to highlight about this graph in particular. The trend line, if you take out last year, holds. So the trend line is still increasing, they're still going up. The change from last year, though, is notable. And so, especially given that we've got a lot of moving parts within that. So this forecast was a great challenge. Our friends at the county have the same revenue stream, and so we've been working closely with them to try to understand a little bit more about how the numbers are moving back and forth. But things like the federal tax law change did incentivize companies to essentially, what amounts to prepay their taxes to us. We also had some repatriation, so profits that were brought back from overseas that required some payments from large companies. That was a one-time amount that we're working on trying to contextualize a little bit better. But overall, the trend line's still pretty good. We've also got a tax rate increase that is embedded this tax year. How that plays out, we'll have to see, because the companies really don't have to pay that higher tax rate until April, and in some cases, if they get an extension, until October. So we're flying a little bit with a little bit cloudier glasses than we normally do. As we move forward, and I would expect that the construction activity, in particular within that revenue stream, to slow. So we've had some massive property transactions over the last few years that have yielded some capital gains to corporations that were required to essentially pay what amounted to one-time monies. And that's been a significant driver. So we wouldn't expect that to continue forever. And there are signs that it may not continue for very much longer. So there's a little bit of uncertainty there. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about sort of contextualizing where we are economically in Portland and what we've been experiencing through this expansion. So as we flip to the next slide, we can talk sort of about the Portland experience from 2010 to 2017. This is census data information. And so all of these categories are related. They all paint the same picture largely. But we've had massive growth in an educated workforce and in median household income growth. That has borne itself out in higher rental costs, higher home values. We are the fastest growing population of people who living with non-relatives. So these are people that need roommates now because housing costs have accelerated beyond incomes. And we'd have the 7th largest increase in commuting time. It's a byproduct of a good economy. One byproduct of a good economy is really bad traffic. And we're certainly have seen that. I'm sure you hear it when you're out in the community. Yeah, I mean, that's the reality. People have more money to do more things. People have more jobs. It's intuitive. I think that would be a byproduct of what we've been experiencing. The other thing,
We also have Uber and Lyft, so there's that.
there is that as well. And so the other thing that I would point out is that we've had population growth has one reason for this happening is population growth has been about 40% faster than household formation growth or housing unit growth. So that's driving a lot of what you're seeing. It feels like we've built a lot, and we have. There's been a lot of building that's still going on. It's not been enough to keep up with population growth. And so when that happens, you see a lot of these byproducts result. As we look sort of broadly at the economic conditions, currently they're pretty good. The federal stimulus is an interesting experiment. The tax cuts came at a time when the economy was doing pretty well anyway. And so it's unclear, it's harder to decouple sort of the stimulus effect within the economy, but the economy is doing pretty well. The graph at the bottom is just illustrative of how different it is right now. There are more job openings than unemployed people in this country, and it's been that way for about 6 months. In fact, the latest data in October shows that there are about 1 million more job openings than unemployed people. So while there is a skills mismatch, perhaps, in some of these cases, the reality is that companies are having trouble finding people. We would expect over the next year or so to see wages be driven higher. We've already seen that in some cases, especially at the lower end. There's companies that are more willing to pull people in and train them on site rather than having them have the experience coming in. So there are byproducts that have been pretty good. The consensus is that there's not going to be a recession in the next 12 to 18 months. It gets a little murkier after that for a variety of reasons. As we flip to the next page, we can talk a little bit about those reasons, the headwinds, as we call them. If we had done this presentation about 6 months ago, I think we'd be more concerned about rising interest rates and inflation. That hasn't materialized to the extent that I think was anticipated relatively recently. In fact, mortgage rates are about at a 6 or 7 month low. So that's easing the concern a little bit. The equity markets are, while not directly related to our revenue sources, do provide sort of an example of some uncertainty within the economy, right? So we're talking about the stock market. It's been bouncing around pretty violently over the last month or so. And that is indicative of sort of the uncertainty around sort of the general economic conditions. And frankly, policies coming out of Washington that can change relatively rapidly around things like tariffs and trade wars and those kinds of things. There is sort of growing concern about 2020. We tend to have a recency bias about the economy. It's been going good. There's no reason it won't go good for a little bit longer. The reality is that the business cycle does still exist. The demographics overall, so the aging baby boomers, sort of create a situation where baseline growth is a little bit lower than it might otherwise be as they age out of their prime earning years. And so that, along with sort of the construction cycle, is the other piece that we're looking at very closely, especially locally, but nationally as well. And so the table at the bottom of that slide is sort of, it was a bit alarming to me, let's put it that way. If we work from left to right, the left is sort of the type of unit, right? The vacancy rates. You'll notice the vacancy rates are the highest amongst the smallest units. The effective annual rent change, so this is rent increases minus concessions. So in large parts of the city, developers and building owners are having to issue large amounts of concessions to get people to move in the door, whether that's a free month rent or other incentives that provide them. So it's net of that. But then we look at the last column and units under construction, and we're building a lot of units in the softest parts of the market. And so and so that going forward, I would expect to create larger decreases in rents, which is not a bad thing. But for developers, it makes their investments more tenuous. And so that in combination with other market conditions, the aforementioned rising interest rates, building loan construction tightening, so construction loans tightening, create a situation, and I think you've probably all been briefed, we're already seeing some of the front end of that at BDS, our Development Services Bureau. And so there's that along with declining amounts of even public sector building probably in the next couple of years. We're doing a lot of that right now. There's not necessarily a lot of that in the pipeline with maybe the exception of OHSU. I'm not sure we can fit a whole lot many more hotels in the downtown area and finance them. So especially given there's, I think, 8 or 9 still in the pipeline to come online. So I think 2020 looks a little bit murkier. We wouldn't expect anything like what happened in 2008, but we are a little bit less sure about sort of where we're going there.
So Josh, I always try to find the good news in your economic reports, and I see an obvious one here, which is if there is a mismatch here in terms of what is available in the market and what is currently under construction, and that actually fits with our affordable housing goals, that means it's going to be a buyer's market relative to what it's been in recent years if you happen to have a source of funding for said housing, which we happen to have. So I think there are actually going to be some good opportunities going forward just by virtue of the fact that there does appear to be a mismatch between supply and demand on the rental side.
No, I think
for the units that frankly we need.
I think that's exactly right from that perspective. I think the overall concern is more about how much longer people will continue to build the units if the market changes dramatically.
Well, and you should be able to infer that based on permit applications.
Right. Yes, and we've seen a pretty massive decline in permit applications. This is a longer-term outlook, sort of. I wanted to put down some forecast scenarios. It's been a long time since we talked about what a recession actually looks like, or what a downturn actually looks like budgetarily. And so while we are in a situation in Portland where right now, let me back up 1 second. The way to think about this is Portland looks budgetarily and economically, frankly, very different from most of the country. We are growing faster than most of the country, as you've seen. We are experiencing those growing pains associated with that. We also look different than we have historically against our own self, against Portland. Portland historically is a different city than it is today. And so that creates that need for greater uncertainty, or that feeling of greater uncertainty. What we did here is I just put down a couple of forecast scenarios. The magnitude of these are garden variety sort of slowdowns given where we are. The magnitude of this is roughly cuts of $30 to $40 million. So when we're talking about a recessionary environment, we're not talking generally about sort of what we call thinning the soup, right? Just sort of picking at edges and stuff. We're talking about stopping doing programs. So if we get to a point where we're doing that, council needs to consider the fact that we're going to need to stop doing some things that we're doing. It's not going to be sort of picking at edges. So I think I just want to put that in some context for you, especially given our exposure in business license taxes and lodging taxes. Those make up a larger proportion of the general fund than they ever have before. And so even a modest downturn can result in some pretty dramatic dollar figures. So as we move to sort of next steps, we will publish an official forecast document by the end of next week. And so we will send that to you, and you should be looking for it. The important dates, we'll get actual COLA data in mid-January. So we're currently forecasting 4%. That would be the highest since 1991. That's putting additional budgetary pressure. As we say, good for employees, bad for the city budget. And so we are sitting there at pretty high levels. We'll issue a forecast update in February and the final forecast near the end of April. We thought we'd lean in a little bit to Commissioner Fisher's Saltzman rule. And just to kind of get a sense of sort of what that means. Over the last 7 years, that median increase has been about, in available resources, has been about $4 million. So, so to the extent that this forecast is where it is, I wouldn't expect a large change, although with the greater uncertainty comes both upside and downside. So that's the general concept of where we are right now. I'm happy to answer some questions. Otherwise, we can kick it back for the past discussion. All right.
So this isn't a question, it's more of a, maybe an aspiration. You're giving us pretty clear direction that the economy is starting to show signs of slowing. And you've painted a couple of scenarios in terms of what that could look like in terms of pressure on the general fund. And we budget year to year, but I think the admonition here is we should really be thinking longer term, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we budget year to year, but the balancing mechanism, the 5-year balancing mechanism does mean that we're not as exposed as we might be otherwise. So you'll notice two things. One, the county has a 3% constraint that they're issuing. Their revenue structure and cost structure is a little different, so it's a little bit apples to oranges, but it's sort of a different scenario. Our balancing, you'll notice that if you look back over the last few years, we've had, say, 20 to 30 million in one time each of the last 3 or 4 years. If we had built that into ongoing, our exposure would be that much more. So we have been disciplined because of the balancing mechanism, the 5-year balancing, so we're not quite as exposed, but it is still significant.
Thank you.
I have a question, it's kind of a comment and a question. Mayor Adams helped us get through the recession thanks partly to the Obama stimulus package. We had good construction jobs, and we also had then Portland Development Commission doing construction in South Waterfront when nobody else was doing construction. And we know that construction jobs tend to be the ones that are family wage jobs that kept people employed. Are there things that we could do now to be thinking about how to be prepared should there be a national recession and therefore some kind of or an infrastructure bill appropriations? Are there things that we should be prioritizing that will help prepare us for the next downturn?
I think we've done some of those things with the capital set aside monies that we've made available. One of the preparations with the Build Portland activity, we've spent a lot of money, or we're spending a lot of money relative to history, not relative to where we need to be maybe, but on infrastructure right now. That will obviously help weather any recession. What I think would be a decent focus, and bureaus could talk about this a little bit more than I can specifically, is the ability to push projects out the door. So whatever that pipeline is, shortening that, making a process as fast as we possibly can, will allow us to be a little bit more nimble should a recession happen, and sort of initiate those dollars quicker.
Of course, I mean, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because we're often incurring O&M on new capital investment. So, I mean, we could have a plan to turbocharge the construction of new parks, for example, and invest resources like systems development charge dollars and other things. But it has the short-term effect of throwing your 5-year forecast out of whack and having to come up. So how do you balance, on the one hand, the desire to maintain a certain level of capital spending with the reality of O&M costs that we have to anticipate that compete with all the other priorities?
No, I think that's absolutely right, Commissioner Fish. I would just say that not all infrastructure spending looks the same or creates the same amount of O&M. I mean, there's if we rebuild a bridge in Peabody, it doesn't have the same impact as building a new park. And so there's strategies within that broad framework to mitigate some of that concern.
By the way, what's our current population?
About 650,000.
And when do you forecast we might hit 700,000?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't have it in front of me. We can expect probably between 1 and 1.5% growth, at least as the economy's good. When the economy falters, migration slows. So that would get us there in, doing the math off the top of my head, let's call it 7 years.
All right. So if there's no further questions, we're going to move on to the performance aspect of today's presentation. This presentation draws heavily on the prior year performance report, as we mentioned earlier, reviewing the results of city programs and services in the context of the previous year's budget. This report provides analysis on budget and performance data, issues recommendations, and poses key questions back to you all. So we're doing a little bit again of the looking back and looking forward. We're looking back at last year's data, but really with an eye towards the issue areas that we know council wants to address during this next budget cycle and beyond. We've organized the report to that end around 7 key issue areas, which have in recent years been consistent areas of focus and investment priorities. For this presentation, we further refined the topics to include just 4 priority areas. Today, we're going to talk about public safety and police accountability, meeting Portland's housing need, increasing city sustainability, and using data and technology to improve government services. For the folks here and watching at home that are eager to know more about the city's performance, I'd encourage you to read the full report and to visit the City Budget Office performance webpage, where, as the slide shows, you can peruse dashboards that highlight performance for every bureau in the city. For today's presentation, from a time management standpoint, I want the group to know that there are many more findings related to the first 2 topics, so we expect those sections to take a lot more time as we walk through. I also want to clarify that when we talk about data, we're not just referring to scientifically significant quantitative data. The Office of Equity and Human Rights recently brought in a facilitator to train city leadership on results-based accountability, and she pointed out that relying on exclusively this type of data perpetuates systems of inequity. So I want everybody to be thinking about when we talk about data, we're not just talking about the traditional use of quantitative data, but there are other areas where we might be able to solicit more qualitative and other types of data as well. So Shannon will begin. Shannon Carney is here, our performance management lead, and she will begin each section with an overview of the topic area, and we'll dive into the findings and close with recommendations. But again, please feel free to jump in with your thoughts and discussion at any point.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. So once again, I'm Shannon Carney from the City Budget Office. And just want to say, before we jump into our first section on meeting Portland's housing need, this work represents a huge body of work from both our CBO analysts and also our partners in the bureaus, thinking about this information, thinking about what it means, and coming up with some next steps to really make the most of our investments. So wanted to provide kudos to those that have worked on this report and the presentation. Thank you. So we start off with housing, and reducing the unmet housing need was the original goal of A Home for Everyone. And I think this section is particularly important given the interest in converting what are currently one-time resources for the Joint Office into ongoing funding. And really what we'll cover in this section is a little bit on what we've done since the state of housing emergency was declared. As you know, it's been 3 years. And as you probably also know, we're at really record service provision on our homeless prevention and our affordable housing development. However, even at these record levels, these services are falling significantly short of demand. And we know this not just anecdotally, but we know this because it's evidenced by wait lists for housing placements, rental assistance, and other programs like home repair and legal aid. While we're doing more than ever before, we actually need better outcomes information to know if we're meeting our goals for the community. Tell myself next slide. So the first slide, we're going to just take a quick look back at the 3 years since the original state of housing emergency was declared, and really look at some of the actions that have come around since then. And these highlight some of the major actions. There's been others as well, but of course, October 7th, 2018 marked 3 years since we declared that state of housing emergency. And over that time, we've really dramatically expanded our funding and programming along the housing continuum. with both a significant investment of one-time funding for both short-term and ongoing services. And one point here as we look at how the actions have changed is that the state of housing emergency has really evolved from being more narrowly focused on immediate responses to homelessness to encompass a much broader swath of, of the entire housing spectrum. And we've added new policies, not only funding, but policies, programs, and of course, regulatory responsibilities to the city's portfolio. So, you know, beyond just the original state of housing emergency, it's highlighting a few of the actions. Of course, we increased our provision of tax increment financing that goes towards affordable housing development. That's really the second note. Year two, most significantly there, of course, we created, along with the county, the Joint Office of Homeless Services with the goal of reducing unmet housing need by June 2017. And then year three, really, you know, lots of things in year three. So we implemented a new inclusionary housing program. We've created the rental service office, and of course, voters have passed several affordable housing bonds, both at the city and the regional level. So what does that mean in terms of?
I just want to interject.
Go ahead.
I just asked Shannon Callahan how much does the city dedicate to the joint office, and the answer is $32 million a year this fiscal year. How much the federal government dedicates to homeless services? $2 million a year. So when people are saying, you know, we should do it all, we can't do it all with that level of imbalance.
Yep, thank you for that, Commissioner. So looking at what all this significant investment means, especially at the local level, we are serving more people than ever before, and over this past year. So that's what we found with our output performance information in FY 2017-18. You can see just on the graphs, the left side is the joint office placement and homeless prevention, so several programs within that joint office funding, whereas the right side is our affordable housing development. And in both cases, it's pretty clear how much we're growing in terms of what we're doing to serve people in the community. And we actually are significantly exceeding even our own service targets. So that's all really good news, and it reflects, you know, basically our commitment to the community and addressing this problem. So on the next slide, I think it's important to note that, as we said in the summary, you know, even though we're providing more services than ever before, it's actually pretty difficult for us to assess the impact on our overall unmet housing need. So in this next slide, what you see on the right is our homeless point in time count, which is really our traditional outcome measure for homeless service provision. And one thing to note is on the top, you see how our level of service is going up. So that's a number from the previous slide. So we're serving more people. You know, around 35,000 in this past year. But what we don't know as much about is how that's impacting our actual number of homeless. Our most recent data is from the January 2017 point in time count, which we conduct every other year. And that's a major challenge, is having that huge lag in data. Obviously, we've ramped up our service provision significantly since then, and so having that as a baseline comparison makes it difficult for us to know what our impacts are. So we do know, and I think it's been noted in other presentations, but we do know that our unsheltered homeless population went down with that January 2017 count. So I think it would be important to know more about, you know, we obviously want to see that trend continue and to understand our impacts.
Can I ask a couple of questions on that? Because I've been hearing this since we got here, that we're putting more into shelter, more into services, more into the transition to housing, more into housing, but we really don't know what the impact is. So could you work with us and the joint office on what data would actually be required to be able to answer that question? I've toured other communities around the country, and they have homeless, you know, data information systems where various nonprofits and government agencies share data, and so they can actually track individuals through the system, and they know what the outcomes are for that individual and what interventions that individual needs. We have big pieces of that system in place, but we don't have a really truly unified system that collects this data. And I think, frankly, we need to stop talking about the lack of information and start doing something about it. So I would encourage, and I'll talk to the chair about this, I would encourage you and the county and the joint office to engage in a thoughtful process about what data we need collected. And then as we contract for services with nonprofit providers, we need to get them onto the same platform. Because collectively, we're putting, what, $63 million now between the city and the county and the joint office, and we need to know what outcomes we're actually getting. I mean, we know some of them. We know how many people received prevention services that didn't become homeless. We know how many people we transferred from the streets or shelter into housing, and those are good data points. But there are other data points we could also have that we just don't have, and we need them.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. And, that's really why we wanted to highlight the lack of data in this conversation today, is to create a little bit more urgency around actually a lot of the work that is underway in the Bureau and the Joint Office. And we'll touch on that a little bit later, but thank you for that.
Okay, so I just
Yeah.
want to put a fine point on this. So do I have your commitment then that we are going to work with the joint office and we're going to identify what specific data sets we need that we don't currently have access to? Are we going to do that?
Absolutely.
Yes, Mayor.
Fabulous, thank you. I appreciate it.
Fantastic. So, and just to piggyback on that a little bit, while we're still on this topic of homeless services outcomes. So one piece of that puzzle, and I think this speaks to, what are the data sets that we need. One proposed solution that we have here is to really move forward with a every other year, so alternating our HUD point in time count with an out year sampling of the homeless population to provide more timely data. And this is something that has been discussed for a while. Again, I think, we know that we need to move forward with understanding, having more data on a yearly basis. And it would also help us understand how homelessness looks different as the seasons change.
Yeah, I was really struck by the Oregonian article a few weeks ago that the number of unsheltered students has gone down in Portland public schools. So that's one other data point. I'm wondering if there are other things like the length of the waiting lists for affordable housing, the number of contacts made by the one point of contact. It seems like there's a lot beyond the point in time. There's other statistics that we could get from service providers, of course disaggregated or aggregated so that we don't get individuals. But even like who signed up for the Oregon Health Plan without an address or with an address that we know that is a post office box or Sisters of the Road, those kinds of things.
Absolutely. So some of that data is already available. It's just a matter of putting it together and thinking about
Yeah,
how.
and it's only their data, but
Yeah.
even like the waiting list for that joint office has. Let's track that year after year.
Right. Thank you. Great. So looking ahead, similar to the point in time count, so one thing we talk about with our affordable housing development is closing the gap. So closing the gap of the affordable housing need that we see in the community. And the challenging thing about this outcome measure is that it is a projection, is an estimate, and it's based on pretty old data. So we have there's a graph that you'll see on the right, and that is really, it's a pretty, I would say, capital E estimate, right? And one thing that we know is that while we can build all the affordable housing units that we have resources for, we do want to know if we're closing that gap. So we wanted to point out that the new rental registration system is going to be a real opportunity to have more data on the rental market in the Portland community, and we can use that data to model what the affordable housing gap is and know a lot more precisely about how those units are landing. All right, so.
I have a quick question.
ahead.
Sorry, just want to go back to the unmet housing need. Sorry to put you on the spot, but
It's fine.
do you know the HUD homeless definition? So there's unsheltered. And
Sure.
then-
So that homelessness be, well, I know the goal, that it be brief, but the definition of homelessness?
Well, because there seems to be 3 different levels. There's unsheltered, there's people who meet the HUD homeless definition, and then I think there's a third population which isn't reflected in this, which is people who are technically homeless but staying with friends or family.
If you could identify yourself for the record, please.
Jane Marie Ford, City Budget Office. So I think you're referring to the doubled up population, which past counts have tried to capture, and that is another way that sampling could be used, or some of these other data sets like school lists, other wait lists can kind of capture the folks who wouldn't be considered technically homeless by the HUD definition, but are still housing vulnerable or have other challenges that might be met through different interventions.
Okay, so people who are doubled up do not meet the HUD definition of homeless. Is that what you just said?
Right, correct.
Okay, great.
But I'm certain there would be overlap in population since the point in time count is a snapshot.
Yeah.
So you would probably see folks who are moving through they're going to be in different places at different points.
Yeah, I mean, the past number that I've heard is 16,000, but that number has been floating around out there for a couple of years, so obviously there is quite a data lag. Oh, hi, Tom. Where'd you come from? And why is your chair so low?
Good morning. Strategic, on someone's part.
Okay, thank you.
Great, yep, thank you. So, so with that, those are just some of the high-level findings that we saw in looking at a wide variety of data on this topic. I'll pass it back to Jessica to talk about next steps in this area.
So again, and I think Shannon covered these really well, and actually with the mayor and Commissioner Fritz's input, you guys already touched on some of our recommendations, but given that the funding level and the supply of housing and homeless services is far greater than it's ever been, and we're still not meeting demand for services, clearly some action needs to be taken. Part of the challenge is what Commissioner Fritz alluded to. We're largely taking this on from a financial standpoint locally on our own. But part of the challenge is that what we refer to as the housing need or the housing crisis includes a very large spectrum of different needs that require distinct approaches and services. So Commissioner Udaley, to your point, and arguably each of those areas have unmet needs. So this fact makes it very difficult to quantify the problem which we're trying to solve, which in turn makes it very challenging to assess the relative impact and effectiveness of our investments. So, to the mayor's point, it's difficult to know if you're on the right train, even if it seems like you're heading in the right direction, if you don't know the final destination of that train. So CBO recommends that we start addressing these challenges by identifying the specific measurable outcome level goals for our homeless services and for our affordable housing portfolio. It's particularly important that we develop these long-term goals and funding plan considering the context of our economic cycle, given all that Josh just said and given the county's release of the 3% reduction targets. Given that demand will likely always outpace resources absent significant changes at the federal level, we also need to identify our highest priority investments and interventions, and be able to track the effectiveness of investments. We can't know if we're being successful unless we define what success looks like. So we need to define what success looks like in both short-term and long-term senses. So also I wanted to say, so we're on the recommendation slide now. And there's a matrix that we're providing with each of our recommended actions. So I think it's really important that we separate the useful long-term tools that are provided by the state of housing emergency, such as the zoning code changes, from the actual declaration of emergency. So we've now been in a state of housing emergency for 3 years, and that has facilitated a lot of really important changes that have helped us address this need. But I think, and I know that the Housing Bureau is looking at this, the ways to sort of preserve some of the tools that provides for us while sort of sunsetting the state of emergency that we've started. In addition, it's really important that we acknowledge that this is not, that houselessness is not a problem that adheres to jurisdictional boundaries, right? It's a regional issue, if not larger. So it's really important that we collaborate with our regional public and private partners to secure commitments for this long-term strategy. So once we know our final destination, we need to increase the availability of information to be able to assess whether we're getting what we want. To be able to achieve our goals efficiently and effectively.
Question.
So, yes, go ahead.
I wasn't on council when the state of emergency was declared and passed, so I don't know offhand if there were specific measures that would justify a sunset. So would it be vacancy rates rising above a certain point? Would it be percentage of cost burdened renters or homeless individuals? I mean, I know our vacancy rate is up, but there is a gross mismatch between what's available and what's needed. And so I mean, the housing emergency isn't over, and I'm not convinced that that vacancy rate change would justify declaring an end to it, so.
That's a good question. So the original goal of A Home for Everyone was to reduce the unmet housing need by half, and the focus was on
Reduce the what?
unmet housing need.
Okay.
And with that original focus of basically unsheltered homelessness. But back to the point of how things have evolved, that now we're looking, much more broadly, and the subsequent ordinances that were passed reflect that broader look. It may make sense to establish some sort of indicator. At the same time, I think given the budget forecast, it probably makes more sense to establish a service level. So while we have that long-term goal in mind, in terms of, actually sunsetting the ordinance, what we recommend in looking at this is that we take the useful pieces of the ordinance, ensure that those are tools in our toolbox for the next 5 years or longer, and then look at what service levels we can provide, and how that's tracking to our long-term goals. So that's what I would say, rather than establishing specific indicators like vacancy rates.
Yeah, I guess I've always associated the state of emergency with renters as much as I have with people experiencing homelessness, because that state of emergency came out of demands advanced by tenant advocates, and one of the first actions was to increase the notice time or at least one of the first tangible actions to the public was to increase notice time for rent increases, significant rent increases, and no cause evictions. So I'm surprised to hear that you consider the focus to be on the unsheltered population.
Just the original focus.
Okay.
So I was just referencing the original goal, which was really an outcome goal, and that original ordinance had a much more narrow focus. Whereas you're right, subsequent updates have had a much larger focus on the rental community.
And I appreciate you saying look at what it does and what it allows us to do, and then do we have long-term, 5-year strategies to do that? One of the examples was it provides some exemptions in the zoning code, which you alluded to. We haven't yet changed the zoning code to make those permanent, so that would be one indicator that is very necessary to locating short-term housing. So we'd need to fix that, just as an example.
Right.
Yeah, I just want to be clear, the Housing Bureau is actually going through an exercise right now, looking at what the emergency ordinance allowed the city to do in order to be responsive to the homeless crisis, to the housing crisis, and trying to figure out either what code changes need to take place or whatever policy changes need to come to the council for review. The way you described it, I think Shannon is correct. The council needed to act to be able to respond to the crisis, but a lot of the actions that the council has taken are things we should be able to do anyway on an ongoing basis. So Shannon Callahan and her team are working through some proposals for the council.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks.
Can I just raise a question? Because I'm all for having more data and better measurements, but I go back to something on page 15 of your PowerPoint where you list actions to address state of housing emergency, and the singular event that you identify as essentially a win is functionally ending veterans' homelessness, which only happened because a president of the United States declared that to be a singular goal of his housing strategy. And we were eligible for vouchers, VASH vouchers, and we worked to streamline the relationship between the VA and our nonprofit partners and the city, and a lot of work went into that. So it begs a question. We did make huge progress on veterans homelessness, but it's because the federal government identified it as a priority, not because Little Portland decided that we were going to end veterans homelessness. And in fact, I can't think of an area of homelessness that is more national in scope than veterans homelessness, because we have nothing to do with declaring war, sending people off, honoring commitments when they come back. And so it begs another question in my mind, which is, are we looking for outcomes and data measurements that are aligned to the resources we have available, or are we setting the goal of assuming we're on our own and we're trying to solve the problem? Because unless we account for partnership and the supply side, we can do all kinds of measurements, but we got to be honest to people about the fundamental limitations of our reach.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does that make clear? Does
Yeah.
that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's 100% right. I would say with that particular victory, it was significantly, as you said, Commissioner, because of the funding that was made available by the federal level. I will also say that the local level, one of the benefits of that support from the feds was that we were able to coalesce around a common goal, and there was a lot of work and collaboration that happened to get us to that goal.
I
But it
remember,
was-
I convened the first meeting with the VA, and it led to a change in leadership in terms of who was overseeing the program, and the VA housing was not their core mission, and so there was a lot of change that had to happen, and then some waivers and the like. But that's an example where we had a robust federal partner.
That's right.
And we were able to make a big dent. There's a lot of talk about Utah and the Utah experience. Of course, what Utah did is they also focused on one part of the homeless crisis, declared victory, but it came at the expense of not investing in other significant parts, and they made some very tough calls about who they were or were not going to prioritize. So again, in terms of what the public hears from us, are we coming up with a set of matrices that say, that hopefully illustrate that we're spending our money wisely? Or are we trying to set up a set of data points that says, here's what it would take to solve the problem, which is also going to underscore the fact that we can't solve the problem with our current resources. We don't have adequate resources.
Yeah.
And without a more robust partner in Washington, we functionally cannot solve the
Yeah.
problem.
I think that those options are exactly right. I think we need to start with having that conversation and figuring out what we would want to achieve, what is a reasonable goal, had we all of the partnership that we would desire from the federal government and other partners, and then look really realistically at what we can achieve without that partnership, because we can't bank on additional funding coming in from the federal government. I will say that there are additional areas regionally where we can enhance our collaboration and our partnership, both with the private sector and with public sector partners. I know that, Commissioner, you are working really hard around the area of permanent supportive housing, and that's an issue area where we're looking to really collaborate with some of our potentially with our private sector partners to help accommodate the full spectrum of services that are needed there.
Just want to make a point. Tom Reinhardt, Chief Administrative Officer, thanks for having me. I appreciate the City Budget Office inviting me today. First off, there's been a lot of conversation among bureau directors in the 3 years since the housing emergency was declared, and we have recently begun asking the Housing Bureau to come in and update directors to continue to instigate conversation among the leadership of the city in terms of what options should be presented to council going forward. So building on Commissioner Fritz's comment about the federal government's current commitments and what Commissioner Fish just laid out in terms of getting clear about what our capacity is and what problems we are trying to solve, I want to thank Director Callahan for being open to that discussion, because they have done a great job coming in and saying, here's what they're thinking now, and being receptive about what a collective proposal would be going forward based on being realistic and stretching ourselves to try to solve parts of this problem. So we are working on that. And I want to close just this comment on this section by saying we cannot overstate how great the work of CBO has been on this performance report. I think it's an underutilized tool, and we have been promoting it in terms of people actually reading it within the bureaus and actually engaging with the data. And to speak more about that point about what data we should actually be collecting, it has really started a good and strong and more serious effort about, we collect a lot of data, to Commissioner Fish's point, what is the most important stuff we should be collecting that we can have an impact upon? So thank you for doing that, and we will continue to work around all these questions around what the future of the housing emergency entails and what we can actually make progress on.
Thank you, CAO Reinhardt. So just to close out this recommendation slide, and I also do want to make clear that, a lot of the things that we're talking about today, a lot of our recommendations are work that is reflecting work that's already underway. We're just trying to elevate sort of the urgency around those needs. But we do recommend that we add an out-year in-field sampling in the summer months, as Shannon discussed, to supplement our current point-in-time count. And then we utilize the opportunity provided by the rental registration system to gather real-time data on the local housing market.
Question, why would we do it in the summer when we do the other one in the winter? That wouldn't necessarily compare apples to apples.
So I think it's arguable either way. I think we don't have any information currently about the houseless population in the summer months.
Mm-hmm.
So especially if we used a different methodology, so the HUD point-in-time count is more of a census, it requires a significant amount of resources to do that. If we have a different methodology so it wouldn't necessarily be apples to apples, as you say, but we'd at least have an apples to orange every other year. So we'd have a sampling, might as well do it at a different time so we can understand more about the summer population.
So it would compare the summer to the following years?
Yeah. I mean, eventually you would have a longitudinal view on
Okay,
it.
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and just one more thing. I mean, I think the sampling methodology, it allows you to gather a little bit more information about inflow and outflow. So where are folks coming from? And I think we could learn a little bit from that as well.
So finally, another recommendation that we have is to really review and dig into performance at the provider level, and this gets to the effectiveness of our investments. So to the mayor's point earlier, and we will commit to working on that with the joint office and with the Housing Bureau and with the county. So moving along.
Okay.
To our second favorite topic.
That's right. So next section. So we're going to talk a little bit about ensuring public safety and police accountability. We can offer a moment for a stretch if needed, but this is a longer section. So this is a really important section too. Public safety made up approximately 59% of general fund expenditures in FY 2017-18, and in spending those resources, we're trying to create better outcomes in terms of our reported crime across the city, but also our emergency response times, which is really an indicator of our service quality in this area. So we're going to look at those indicators. We'll look at call volume, and then we'll also look at what we're doing around police accountability, staffing, and use of overtime. So to get started. Touching on crime rates, so reported property and person crime rates, we really only have 3 years of data because of a recent change in how we record these types of data. But these are, obviously an important indicator of the effectiveness of our system. And generally speaking, they have been going up over the last 2 years. So that is pretty evident when you look at the crimes against property on the top and then the crimes against persons in the second layer there. Crimes against society are typically more of a proactive indicator. So, those are crimes like gambling, prostitution that reflect the Bureau's efforts towards solving some of those things. In terms of what we see over the longer term, and this isn't in the graph, but when you look longer term, 10, 20 years, reported crime rates are fairly low in Portland. And that's especially when you look at violent crime rates. And that's over that longer year time horizon. But I do think it's important to note the uptick over the last few years. So what are we doing about that? And that's a big question. So clearly, we have added, in this year's budget, the Police Bureau added 49 officers in.
Before you move on, can I ask
Yeah,
you a
go ahead.
question just about the presentation of the data so that I understand it? So
Sure.
fiscal year 15-16, you have 74.32. What is the 74.32?
Sure. So that is 74.32 crimes against, so actual property offenses.
Per 1,000
residents.
residents.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the Police Bureau's key performance measure around that.
Got it.
And actually, I'm glad we touched on that because so one thing that may or may not be obvious from the visual is that property crimes comprise the vast majority of crimes. So that's meant to show, the bar graph is meant to show that. So they're about 80% of crimes committed in the city. Any other questions on that?
Do we keep comparative data about how, what are the equivalent numbers of peer cities?
You know, I don't have that right at my fingertips, but I'm sure that we could take a look at that. And
Well, that would be one way of knowing whether we're even in the same ballpark, right? So that would, if the number was substantially off, because, again, we can debate at great length the question of how are these numbers arrived at, are people adequately reporting crimes, what's our methodology, et cetera. But what it's useful for is trend line. It shows trends. So that was, even with the imperfect methodology of the auditor's survey, you got trends over time, and that was helpful. But I think it'd be interesting, to the extent we consider, peer cities like, by population, like Atlanta, Seattle, and others, I think it would be interesting to know where they are in terms of property crimes per 1,000 residents, just to know how we measure up.
thank you.
Some
Yes.
context.
We can definitely take a look at that and work with the Bureau on that.
Shannon, before you go on, Commissioner Fish, my team has reached out to a number of peer cities on some costs of police and fire, facilities, fleet, technology, overtime, and I'm happy to collaborate with the budget office on the peer city research.
Yeah, I would love to have those numbers at my fingertips for all the people from out of state that are railing at us for what they see on the Fox News. What a terrible place we are. I'm like, no, actually, your place is worse.
Right, that is the power of data. Yes.
Is there any further breakdown available within these categories of the types of crimes? For instance, crimes against property can include anything from trespassing and vandalism to arson, burglary, and more serious crimes. And I'm interested in seeing how much of this is being driven by poverty and homelessness. Because if we have hundreds of people trespassing to try to find somewhere dry to sleep at night, that's not an indicator to me that we need more police on the streets.
So differentiating major property crimes from lower level.
Yeah.
Great.
Is that available, or?
I don't know that.
It's not in, I mean, I'm sure that the
great
Bureau has that.
Okay.
Yeah, we can, sounds like there's a little bit of follow-up on this
Well,
section.
if anybody's listening, I would like that information.
AC Davis says it's available.
Okay, thank you.
Great. So, and we'll talk a little bit about recommendations with regards to reported crime. But and just noting that, we have added resources to the Police Bureau that will take time to see if those additional officers can make a dent in this sort of population level indicator. Yeah.
I think your statements about that got buried in our going back to the previous table. Just
Oh,
say
sure.
again how many
So
positions we added.
We added 55 positions in last year's budget, but 49 officer positions that would relate to this type of work. So I just wanted to note that because that's something that, we could see impacts in the out years on that. Clearly, we wouldn't see them, this year, but something to check in on as we move into future years. The other thing I'd like to note is we do have other programs outside of the Bureau that seek to address crime rates. So one in particular is Civic Life's property crime prevention program. And that's a pretty key strategy for addressing property crime. Wanted to note that Civic Life has made changes to their program structure to make it more aligned with precinct boundaries, more team-based approach. And the Bureau is really hoping that makes the program more effective. So I know there's been a lot of movement on that, so I just wanted to mention that. And we can see if some of those changes might have an impact. Okay, so there's a lot to cover in this section. So the next, we're going to look at the different bureaus and how we're doing around our call volume and how that translates into emergency response times. So we'll start with the Police Bureau. So whether we refer to it as call volume, calls for service, incidents, really the demand for our public safety agencies has increased pretty steadily over the last few years for Police Bureau, Fire Bureau, and for emergency communications. Generally, these two indicators have what I note is an inverse relationship. As demand for those services increases, we would expect those response times to slow down, all else being equal. And here we're going to focus just on the actual volume. So with the Police Bureau, this graph is showing you dispatch calls by type. So high, medium, and low. As you can see, those have increased over the last 6 years. But really, that increase, if you look a little bit more closely, has been driven by low and medium priority calls, which we know from the Bureau tend to be disorder type calls.
Could you define a few things here? Could you define dispatched calls, please?
So dispatch calls, I might need my police analyst to have a more precise definition.
And I'd also like to know the difference between a low and a medium priority, if you could give us some examples.
Sure. Katie Shea for the City Budget Office. We also have folks here from the Police Bureau that may be better suited to answer this question. The first question was, remind me?
What is a dispatched call?
So this is actually two different types of calls. You'll see dispatch calls, which is basically like, calls coming into BOEC that an officer is dispatched to. And it's also calls that an officer self-dispatches to. So an officer sees something, they'll call in, report in, and say, I'm dispatching myself to this call. So it's both of those call types embedded in there. And then as far as
is dispatched calls a subset of calls received by BOEC?
it would be, dispatch calls specifically for the Police Bureau, yes, would be a subset of calls received by BOEC.
Would dispatched calls into BOEC to the Police Bureau be a subset of calls to the Police Bureau? So you have self-dispatched and you have BOEC dispatched. Is that all of the calls that come into BOEC for the police?
It's all the calls that come into BOEC for the police, I believe, but the Police Bureau is also going to be receiving, sort of online reporting and telephone reporting. I'm looking over at AC Davis to confirm that.
That's a small
It's a small
percentage,
percent,
right?
yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, I think that's helpful. And then could I just get some idea of what the difference between a medium and a low priority call is?
Sure. All of it has to do with sort of the urgency of the call and whether or not there's sort of an active crime or issue in progress. So you can have very serious crimes that can sometimes be a low priority just because, the incident, if you will, has already passed. So, the urgency of arriving within 6 minutes isn't necessarily there.
Is that discretionary, or are there an actual list of calls, types of crimes that are considered by definition medium priority and others by definition low priority? How are you determining what goes into these categories?
So these are categories determined by, sort of BOEC and dispatching. Right now, there's actually a pilot program in place that there's a sergeant for, I believe, the first time at BOEC, sort of helping to prioritize those calls and saying, like, that's probably a medium priority, this is a high priority, because it is a little bit of a sort of, a discretionary activity, right? It's sort of prioritizing those calls. So my understanding is that there are some types of calls that would always be a high priority, but there's a fair amount of sort of discretion based on whether or not there's urgency in
This is
arriving.
helpful, and the reason I'm asking all these annoying questions is I'm trying to get at the growth rate of low priority calls. Is it a thing, or are we changing the definition of some calls that used to be medium priority based on the number of officers available to respond? How do we know that low priority in 2013 was the same as low priority in 2018?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And actually, we talked with the Police Bureau about that because it's a little bit of both, right? So there's only so many officers responding to calls, and so that there is some sort of changing over time in what is a high priority call, just because there's only so many high priority calls that you can physically respond to, right? So in that sense, things do get pushed down to medium or lower priority calls, just based on the sheer volume and ability to respond. That said, in talking to the Strategic Services Division at Police, they can kind of confirm for us that the driving factors and increased call volume, especially for those low priority calls, are really around the disorder type calls that are generally a lower priority.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor, Katie is our CBO analyst at OMF. I've never heard her tell me I asked a fantastic question. So good work. But I'm going to try. So
They'll get there, Tom.
Katie, in the pop, I set myself up. So, Katie, in the high, medium, low priority aggregate, do we know with the population growth in Portland that was referred to when Josh was up here? No, I was. I'm not. Thank you very much.
It was my question. Commensurate
I've ever heard.
population growth.
That's it. Does it
fantastic
trend with
question, Tom.
population growth? It's a very serious question.
Yeah.
Does it trend with population growth? Are we out of whack in terms of the growth of all those call categories, irrespective to our population growth?
I just Googled it.
Obviously, those trends go together. I can't recall off the top of my head how much of these sort of like nominal amounts are driven by demand. I'm looking around to see if anybody else around here knows that off their head, but we can get you that information.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for asking my question. And I just want to point out to everyone at the table, when I look at this chart, I only see a change in the gray. The blue and orange boxes look relatively the same, but I did the math. So in high priority calls, we've seen less than a 10% increase in 5 years. Medium priority calls, 25% increase, and low priority, 32% increase.
Yep.
These graphs can be a little challenging. And I do think that population growth, we have to look at population growth at the same time to really understand these numbers.
Right, and Josh just came up here and gave us that the population growth over that time has been 8% versus a 30% growth in call volume.
Yeah. 8% over 5 years.
You think like an economist.
I don't know what is happening.
Josh, you've had an influence, whether you know it or not.
I'll take it.
Okay, that's great.
Thanks, Katie.
We might need you again then, we'll see.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Appreciate
great
that.
discussion. So, so sticking with this Police Bureau calls for service, so again, with the high, medium, and low priority calls, so the inverse of the call volume, as we spoke before, is that what is that response time? And here you see that across the board, response times have gone up over the last 5 years, but they've gone up most precipitously with medium and low priority calls, so similar to how you saw in the other graph. And specifically with the high priority call volume, things have remained pretty stable over the past to the prior year, so between 16-17 and 17-18, and that's worth noting as well. So for high priority, that's 6.6 minutes in average travel time and 2 minutes in average dispatch queue time. Any questions on that?
I don't have a question, I have a comment to Will Ammetweek and others. I was only in charge of BOAC for 5 months, so any of this is a result of some things that happened actually during the recession at BOAC, where we were not able to have as many people in the academy and getting trained. Also the changeover to the new computer system there, which then had an effect on call times in the 12 to 16 area where Commissioner Novick was in charge. And then I think we're also seeing the reflection of what's happening with the call volumes going up, the crime levels going up a little bit, and then that has the effect here. So it's all tying it together.
Certainly, and we'll talk more specifically about BOAC as well. Yeah, and because this is primarily the resources from the Police Bureau side of the call, and that because that entire response time is, someone calls 911, they reach emergency communications, and then they're moved along, dispatched, and then an officer responds.
So what's meant by queue time?
All these technical questions. So, do you want to come on up? Great, thank you.
So, yeah, to your point, Commissioner, Chris
Identify
Davis
yeah, hold on.
from the Police Bureau. This graphic here actually only represents what happens to the call once BOAC is done with it. And
Okay.
it's in our hands. And so this is the time from when BOAC has set up the call. It's in the system. Queue time is the time that the call waits for an officer to become available to take it after it gets in the system.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was easy. Thank you.
Great. So, in keeping with looking again at this, continuing on call volume and emergency response, wanted to touch on some of the other bureaus as well, because the trends are actually a little bit different depending on our agency that we look at. So this graph is talking about fire high priority calls, so fire bureau incidents and response to those incidents. And here you see really my main takeaway is that response times from the Fire Bureau have actually held fairly steady. Now, I know that the graph doesn't communicate that immediately. See the big blip in 16-17, but in looking at the data, it's understood that a lot of that additional travel time might have come from the January months when we had the snowstorm that year, and our public response was quite impacted for a period of time. And other than that, we see the response times holding pretty steady. So
Shannon, before you go, what do you
Yeah.
attribute that to? I neglected to ask this in the prep, so sorry.
the snow or the,
Just know the generally holding steady.
Yeah.
Have there been operational changes or best
Exactly.
practice improvements with?
yeah, thank you. So in holding steady in spite of increased workload, right? So that's the really interesting thing. So there's a couple different things that we see the Bureau implementing that are notable. One is the implementation of automatic vehicle locator. So that's using GPS on apparatus so that the closest fire truck can be assigned to an incident and not just the fire truck that's housed within that fire management area. So that's a big change that the Bureau's put into place. They've also made some more nuts and bolts changes, like having in-service training efforts to allow firefighters to train at their station, and that reduces out-of-service time and demand on other firefighters to backfill. And then things like reopening Fire Station 23, frankly, which decreased response times in Clinton Triangle and Southeast Portland.
Do high-priority incidents include urgent medical incidents, or are they limited to fire incidents?
Good question. So they are, they include medical incidents. In fact, that's the bulk of high priority incidents that the Fire Bureau is responding to. And those are in the orange category. So or the orange bar, rather. And then fire is a pretty small portion of incidents that PFR responds to. That's the red. And then other incident types that don't fall in either of those categories. Good question. So BOIC. 911 calls are also going up at BOIC if you look at a trend over several years. And one takeaway here is that really that growth is actually being driven by non-emergency calls. So I know that there's a lot going on with this graph, but emergency calls are in the red bar and non-emergency calls are in the gray. And you see the sum is the sort of the yellow line up top. So that's a pretty interesting trend. And I think it speaks to next steps in the sense of we know that there's a push around having better non-emergency communication with our community through 311. That won't necessarily be a solution right away, but is that a longer-term solution to what we're seeing in growth around non-emergency calls to BOIC? BOIC is also, I think I want to note here, it's not on the graph, but BOIC has also maintained essentially their call response time. So that's, their key measure is the percentage of calls that are answered within 20 seconds. And the report there is, we're still answering about 64% of calls within that 20-second period, and that's about the same as the reported time that we had from 16-17, despite the increase in call volume. So, and again, BOIC is making some changes to their business processes. They've added staff, so some promising things at work there, and we're hoping to see even better outcomes in the future. I'll keep moving here. I know we have a lot to cover. All right, so wanted to touch on the important topic of police accountability. And here we really see the Police Bureau and the city at large. We have multiple efforts underway, and we're making a significant amount of investment on this front. So the Police Open Data Portal, I think this is one where we actually don't talk about it enough. There's a huge amount of policing data and analysis available on the Bureau's Open Data Portal. It even includes data on PPB's use of force. So it's a very open data portal, a lot of interesting information there. And that's a really important step in terms of transparency and accountability with the community. Making that information available. There's new audit services staff in the Bureau, and that's looking more broadly at implementing professional standards and then providing additional communication back to operational staff. Of course, we have the body camera program. It provides for $1.7 million in ongoing and 4 FTE as it was approved in 16-17. And once implemented, we're really looking to have that program be evaluated for impacts on measures of police accountability.
But to be clear, the council hasn't said to go ahead with it yet. that is interesting. I think that's one thing where that
That's fair, and it sounds like the Bureau needs to come forward with their plan. It has been, from the budget perspective, so from our side of the table, it's been approved for several years.
Right, so we've got the money there should the council choose to do it, and I'm sure once Commissioner Hardisty gets here, we'll have that conversation.
Fair enough. Good point there. Well, thank you. So, and just one last thing on police accountability is the compliance officer and community liaison, and then the new Portland Community on Community Engagement Policing, so the COPA PSAP. We have some significant resources dedicated towards those activities this year, really intended to increase our community members' access to the Bureau, create those spaces in which members are able to air grievances, voice policy concerns, and make recommendations. So we'll be looking for impacts of those changes as well. All right. Everyone's favorite topic, use of overtime at public safety agencies. So I want to keep this high level. So we do see some different trends in terms of our use of overtime, whether we're depending on which bureau we're looking at. Use of overtime at BOEC promisingly has decreased 25% from the prior year. And you know, that's probably mostly from the Bureau's staffing up. So they've been able to add staff, whereas in previous years, we didn't see as much of that. They've also particularly reduced their use of forced overtime, which is great for employee involvement. Moving on, looking at the Fire Bureau. This one is a little bit confusing, admittedly. So an interesting finding here is that even though the non-reimbursable overtime hours, so those are overtime hours that essentially the Bureau is paying for, doesn't include things like wildfire assignments and where we're getting fully reimbursed by outside agencies, the number of hours actually went down. However, the spending went up slightly, just a touch from last year. And there's a couple reasons for that. One major driver is that as the cost per hour of a firefighter increases, just, you know, with our labor costs, as our labor costs rise, you know, time and a half increases even more. There's also some wonky changes where basically there's a retroactive pay amount that hit in last year. So that may account for actually the net of the difference. But I think the key message there is as our labor costs rise for these types of employees in the city, the cost of overtime becomes even more of a driver on those budgets.
Why, if the overtime has increased slightly, why is the bar for 2017-18 actually the way it's
down?
reduced
Sure.
down?
No, that's a fair question, and that's mostly a graph design issue. But I would say we're really trying to communicate two pieces of important information there, and the bar is showing you overtime hours paid. So that actually did go down by 5%. So the bar, if you look to the left, is around about 200,000 hours, and then. But we're also trying to communicate is that the cost actually went up.
So the cost per hour is higher, but the number of hours is lower?
Exactly. Okay, so want to have just one more finding around overtime, and then we'll move to our summary. And that's really that is that the total cost of Police Bureau, when we look at the Police Bureau, our overtime spending has gone up, and so last year it was 11.6 million. You see that from the graph. That's a 9.4% increase over the prior year. And then again, this graph is sort of set up similarly where the bars show the overtime hours paid. In this case, both our number of hours have gone up and our overtime hours cost. So it's really driven by both the number of hours and the cost per hour of overtime, especially with changes in officer compensation. So that is an important finding, and I know that there's been a lot of work collaboratively across the bureaus to take a look at that, and I'll let Tom and Jessica speak to that a little bit in our next step slides.
So briefly to summarize what we just went through. So our key findings are really that emergency calls for service are increasing. All of our key public safety bureaus, police, BOEC, and fire have all maintained their emergency response times in the face of rising demand, and that's a real achievement. So again, the purpose of this presentation is not just to highlight the things that need improvement, but also to highlight where wins are happening, and bureaus are using data or other process improvements to maintain service levels despite challenges. Additionally, CBO recommends that ongoing Police Bureau pilots should be evaluated for impacts on response times and officer availability, including the new community service officers, or the PS3s, and the BOIC sergeant pilot, which Katie alluded to, that's over at BOIC currently. So again, there's a lot of exciting things happening in these bureaus, and there's also a lot of resources that have been dedicated to increased staffing. So we just want to note that we got to keep an eye on the impact of those investments. One of the other findings is clearly that reported person and property crimes have worsened in recent years. Again, so tracking the impact of the additional officers on crime rates, and to Commissioner Udaley's point, I want to add that, perhaps disaggregating that information a little bit better so we understand what the drivers, and then therefore understanding that maybe an officer is not the appropriate, increasing officers might not be the appropriate response to reduce crime rates in all situations. And then also on that note, to look at the other ways that we address crime throughout the city, which includes the Office of Community and Civic Life and the Crime Prevention Program. And so looking closely at that program and figuring out a way to measure that program's performance and join that with our overall public safety goals and our crime prevention goals. Finally, with the overtime cost increase, CEO Reinhardt has been working on this issue, and I'm going to turn it over to him.
So, Council, if we hearken back to a few weeks ago when Chief Financial Officer Cooperman was addressing you on long-term financial strategies and planning, I think you'll remember that the personnel costs part of the graph was shown to rapidly be approaching 70% of general fund resources and forecasted to go above that. If we connect that to what our city economist just laid out in terms of looking at potentially more limited general fund resources in the near term, I want you to know that we got ahead of this on overtime costs, and I want to credit Director Summers McGee, our CHRO, and Ashley Grundy from her team, who have worked closely with AC Davis and Catherine Ryland and others from the Police Bureau on really looking at what can be done on police overtime costs as a first effort. I know Council directed this in the last budget cycle and had very direct conversations around wanting to see that reduced in any way possible and responsibly done. They have come up with a series of options that they're looking at a menu of potential actions, working with the mayor's office on what to propose, but it is safe to say that there are potentially some very significant savings there. And I want to credit everybody for doing a lot of hard work, not easy work at a table together to figure that out. We also believe that those types of pilots should be extended. So in the other couple slides you saw here, we do think there's opportunities to change the way we actually just assign and how we manage it internally so that overtime costs can be more effectively controlled. Any slight reduction we have in personnel costs over the near and medium term, as you know, have huge implications long term. So please look forward to more specific proposals from us, but I wanted to give credit where credit is due because we added that to people's job duties over the last 6 months, and they really came through.
Great. Thank you, Tom. Okay, so we have 20 minutes left, so I'm going to keep it pretty high level in talking about the last two sections. And there's these are a little bit shorter in terms of the findings, but I do think they're really important. So we look at increasing city sustainability. This section, we're looking at our trends around our carbon reduction efforts and transportation mode share. The city of Portland has been at the forefront of many policies and regulations in this arena. What we find is really probably more drastic interventions may be needed to ensure that we're meeting our goals in the future. So, and this first graph really communicates that pretty well, I think. So when we look at our carbon emissions, this graph shows the reduction in per person carbon emissions from 1990 levels. So it's a little bit of something to wrap your brain around, but what we're trying to understand is how much are we reducing our carbon emissions from a set point in the past. And for a long time, we were making a lot of progress on that, and that progress has really stagnated over the last 4 years. Josh had talked earlier in the presentation about the booming economy and how we're seeing more traffic woes. And it does correspond with an increase in transportation sector emissions that we saw for the first time since '07. So one potential reason, we don't know for sure, but one potential reason for this stagnation could be our increase in transportation sector emissions.
And when did we approve Uber and Lyft?
That's what I was just.
I mean, I can't remember. That was actually a serious
certainly
question.
during those years, yeah. Sure. And so there's other changes too. In terms of what we're doing about that, we're doing a lot, you know. The Bureau of Planning and Sustainability has obviously a lead role in this. They are working to address the issue by implementing the Climate Action Plan. We've got strategies around increasing our use of active transportation, which we'll talk about on the next slide, but also renewable fuels. So the Poop to Power program, I hate to mention it while Commissioner Fish is out, but there's almost too many things in the city to even talk about adequately. But that program a new program where we're converting wastewater into natural gas for our fleet and then selling the remainder to the private sector. So that's just one thing we're doing. We're electrifying our fleet to reduce emissions. So I think one interesting thing here is it would be great to know more about the impacts of those specific programs. You know, the localized impacts, and so that we're able to continue to lead and sort of show our work, if you will. We're committed to city-to-city pacts and international commitments to reduce carbon, and we're doing our work. So I think we want to show what those impacts of those programs are.
So I'll put in a shameless plug for our diesel procurement strategy, which is coming to council soon.
Excellent.
And you know, my suspicion is that part of this dramatic increase that you see in 14-15 that's been maintained has to do with construction as well. We don't control private sector fleets.
Right.
And as you know, Oregon is something of a wild, wild west when it comes to diesel emissions. And that, to me, is an obvious area where we could get back on track with our carbon emission goals.
Fantastic.
Is addressing that at the state level.
Great point, Mayor. Thank you. And so we
You
talked.
missed the conversation about Poop to Power. We were feeling sorry for you.
Got to mention.
Hey, thank you for raising it. And,
Welcome.
you know, we'll use, we process 30 million gallons of wastewater a year. The byproduct, one of the most significant byproducts is methane gas, which we currently use for a variety of purposes, including generating electricity. But the real promise here is converting it to renewable natural gas, running our trucks, selling the excess capacity on the market, and returning a profit for our ratepayers. So that's the triple dividend if it all works out.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So thank you for mentioning that.
Excellent. So one more slide in this section. We track our active transportation usage in Portland. And here's one where we know that we perform, generally speaking, we have higher active transportation modes than other cities. But we're well below our long-term target. So the Bureau of Transportation has a long-term target of 70% of Portlanders using walking, bicycling, and transit modes. And so that's an interesting thing. Again, this is one where the Bureau is doing a lot to counterbalance this, and we also have policies in places that create an environment that we need to monitor as well. So we just wanted to point this out because I think these strategies, the Portland Progress, Climate Action Plan, and the Bike Plan, are additional levers we can use and tools that we have to address, our carbon emissions.
So walking went up a bit, biking stayed the same, transit went down. Sorry, the other way around. But yeah, transit went down. So when the city of Corvallis went fare-free, their ridership increased 37%. And I think we need to do something like that, particularly since we know that there's 1 million car rides a year that weren't happening before we authorized the transportation network companies, which Commissioner Udaley looked up, and it was the end of 2014.
Fantastic. Thank you for grabbing that. Yep. Great point there. Yep. So in addition to that as a strategy, we have some ideas about how to move this forward.
Yeah, so really kind of the overarching story of this area is that we've done fantastic work. We've established some really great high-level visionary goals. But what we find that we're missing is sort of the performance reporting on the individual efforts that we're doing and how those are helping us get to those larger visionary goals. So our recommendation is that performance reporting, we should enhance our performance reporting on some of these many efforts that we're making and understand specifically how we're beginning to move the needle locally. Again, this is another issue area where there's a lot of policies in place, either federally or at the state level, that impact our ability to reach these overall goals. So we need to understand really locally what are we capable of doing, and are we taking the best steps to get where we're trying to go. As part of this, we also want to leverage our partners to achieve city sustainability goals through some of the opportunities we've already taken advantage of. These include Bloomberg American Cities Climate Challenge, Smart Cities Initiative, and Zero Net Carbon Cities Project. And then, again, this is specifically with regards to active transportation, again, expanding our publicly reported performance measures to capture all of the impacts all of the efforts that particularly the Transportation Bureau is undertaking to reach our active transportation goals.
Thank you. Okay, last but not least, using data and technology to improve government outcomes. And this is where we want to highlight some big wins that we're seeing in the bureaus that we'd love to see spread. That's our really, and hopefully Tom will be able to speak to that. It's talking about how we've used data analytics in our Bureau of Human Resources to improve our performance. We also want to touch on some areas where we're still seeing challenges, and that's mostly around data management and reporting. We'll look at a particular use case on equity. So, first up, so data management and really moving towards a more modern business intelligence system is important for the city to be able to achieve better results with our current resources. And I can't say this enough. I mean, this is something that the bureaus are thinking about and looking out over the next few years. And we know that we can't just keep applying new resources towards our same problems. We have to be able to think about doing things differently. And one key strategy with that is having better information on what we're doing and then making different decisions from that. So we do have multiple pilots in place, and they're pretty exciting. They are cross-bureau. So both of these pilots here that I described a little bit, the Portland Urban Data Lake, I know you've heard a lot about that as part of our Smart Cities initiative. And that's one where the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability is collaborating with, not only technology and transportation here in the city, but also with our regional partners, Metro and TriMet. There's a phase 1 pilot around this that's around transportation, really. So without going into, the specifics of the technology, the interesting thing is I think that pilot really paves the way for the long-term vision of how we manage our data and share our data with the public. But it doesn't actually address our internal challenges, which are significant. So I just wanted to note that. So one way that other bureaus are looking to address those internal data management challenges and move the ball forward is specifically, the Tableau platform. So that's just one example. There's several bureaus that have established basically this data analytics platform within their bureau. And then there's an effort from bureaus that are interested in having a more citywide enterprise business intelligence system. So again, without getting into the nitty gritty, that's really one where moving forward and applying resources to either to establish a citywide enterprise system or an enterprise system specifically for small bureaus that can't go it alone would be a really good way to ensure that we're continuing to get data on our biggest priorities. So, when we look at livability issues where we have 12 to 15 programs across at least 10 city bureaus, and we want to understand our impacts, we really can't know that because we don't have a way of efficiently or effectively sharing information between bureaus and then up to council. So it's really important to be able to make progress in especially those collaborative areas.
Shannon or Jessica,
Yeah.
could you speak to the intermittent push to have just enterprise Tableau system and what that could potentially do? And I'm asking in the context of, for citywide policymakers to not have the full lens on some of these data questions. That conversation has happened. Where does the current CBO position on that? And could you educate them on whether that would be valuable or not?
Sure, yeah, so really our intersection with this is through performance management. So we have a lens on how the bureaus are tracking information and how they're using that information to improve their own operations. So that's and we're a convener of essentially analysts across the city. There's been packages put forward previously, and there's been a lot of conversations over the last, I'd say, year and a half. CBO has worked with analysts in the Bureau to to present to our Technology Executive Steering Committee a business case for having an enterprise business intelligence platform. We are still supporting that, and I think what CBO is trying to do is help convene Bureau staff to move the ball forward there and to make sure that interest is still known and that bubbles up through our Technology Steering Committee. So we'd love to see a direction develop around specifically enterprise visualization and analytics. So that could translate into Tableau server. It probably would require additional staff resources at BTS, at least a staff person to support that.
Thank you.
Great. So one more use case. So I mentioned a couple of the sort of high-level use cases like livability, where we do need that enterprise view of data management to even know what we're doing. But another really key area, and this is one we don't talk a lot about, how technology impacts our equity outcomes, is around equity. So we know that equity is a core value, and we're seeing that change in our organizational culture. And we're seeing that even through our performance measures. So almost 100% of city employees are now trained in Equity 101. That wasn't the case several years ago. That was just a nascent goal. And we have, I believe, almost all of our bureaus, might be 100%, have their racial equity plans in place. So we're seeing an organizational shift. What we're not seeing necessarily is knowledge of what and this kind of harkens back to the where we started with housing. We want to know how that impacts our outcomes. So we want to know, does that mean we're translating more documents into the essential languages across our bureaus? We want to know if that means that we're removing more barriers through our investments in infrastructure, both through bureau investments and then at the citywide level. And that's where we actually don't know that. And I think that's not a new trend. That's something where we just don't necessarily have the reporting coming in through our Office of Equity. And I think that's for a lot of reasons. I mean, I think bureaus are, they are busy and they are challenged by housing that data and then reporting it. And I do think we can move the needle if we have something like a Tableau server and enterprise business intelligence to help support that. Because oftentimes it's bureaus just don't necessarily have the in-house capability to do this, and they need more support.
So duly noted on these issues. I do want to point out in terms of the ADA transition barriers removed, some bureaus have done. So this may not reflect a ongoing effort. When I was in charge of development services, we removed all the barriers. So there may be some that come up that then need to be addressed, but it wouldn't be surprising to me if their response was we took out zero because we already did it.
Right.
The majority of them now still are in parks that doesn't have funding for it. So
So it could be something there too.
yeah,
Absolutely.
I just don't want it to look like everybody's ignoring that because it doesn't reflect. You could have a different performance measure, bureaus that have completely removed all their barriers.
Absolutely, and I think, I don't know, Jam. I think what Jay-Marie might have said is we need to know. Part of the reason we wanted to include that is just we do want to know the reporting from the bureaus. So even if the number's zero, then we need to know that.
Yeah, and we need a measure that reflects that rather than how many have you done this year, which may not. But yes,
Excellent.
duly
Thank you for
noted,
that
and I
point.
really appreciate this information. I'll take care of it.
Thank you. Great. I think we have a few minutes left. So do you want to touch on some of the successes we've seen with Bureau for Human Resources?
We're running short of time, so I'll leave my speech aside. I do want to say on this human resources recruitment timelines improvement, you see the data in front of you. When I started my role as CAO, two of the things that Bureau leadership and staff told me were the following. Tom, if you can do anything about recruitment timelines, if you can do anything about procurement timelines, God love you, basically, is what they said to me. So I want to report that what we've learned here is utilization of the data and daylighting the role of the Bureau, Internal Service Bureau, and the Partner Bureau were pivotal here. So we have now gotten through that, and thank you all as well for supporting both of those reforms and the Construction Services Division and Procurement, because we're learning how to do this with data and with clear understanding on each side what has to be done in each bureau to make sure that these are timely. So that's all I wanted to say on that, and we will continue to work with the data and work with CBO to improve.
I do just want to note on that there's perhaps a skew in the data in that sometimes recruitments are not opening in a timely manner because human resources is swamped with the current ones. So yes, we may have improved the recruitment completion, but have we improved the vacancy
How quickly we
to
open.
hiring? That
Thank
would
you
be
for that.
another measure.
Great. So in our final couple of minutes, I'm just going to close. So we've talked a lot about the importance of data and governance. We know data is not always flashy. Getting the right data to empower good decision-making can be extremely challenging, but the reward is well worth it, which we've tried to show with the highlights and some of the wins in this section. In terms of next steps, so one of the key next steps, Shannon, can you explain? Yeah, thank you. One of the key next steps is just to continue reviewing performance information on an ongoing basis. This plays in really well with some of our changes to the budget process. There's a few tools at your disposal to use performance information to help inform your decision-making going forward through the budget process. That's through the move to program offers. Each program offer is expected to have connected relevant performance information. It will look a little wonky this year for a number of programs across the city because this is the first time we're really taking that viewpoint. But for many bureaus and programs, we'll be able to see that data, and that'll be really informative. And also the tool of the direction to develop process. So through directions to develop, you can ask one or more bureaus to what it would take to provide a proposal of what it would take to achieve a certain outcome, and really charge your subject matter experts in the bureaus to provide you with an idea of what it would take to get to the outcomes that you'd like to see. In terms of outstanding items that I heard today to work on, our office will work with the county, joint office, and PHB on what data is needed to assess the impact of our homeless services. We'll look at what other homeless data indicators are available to help give us a more robust picture of the houseless population. We'll work with the CAO and Portland Police Bureau on comparative crime data, and we will look at differentiating the crime data between types of crime. And CEO Reinhardt, did you have any other?
Nothing to add.
So I want to ask my colleagues, and I want to ask our budget advisors if they have any further comments, thoughts, questions. Good. This was a great presentation. It raised a bunch of very interesting and provocative and timely issues. Thanks for preparing it for us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're adjourned.